Imagine spending 2 weeks walking roughly 75 miles in the same clothes with no shower to a campsite. Sounds delightful, doesn't it? Now imagine finally reaching that campsite only to have to spend weeks longer in the bitter cold, crossing through a glacier, scaling a dangerous mountain, and rolling the dice as to whether or not you'll be alive in a few weeks. This journey is better known as the expedition to the summit of Mount Everest. And despite it sounding like a crazy idea, there are hundreds who attempt it every year. Today I'd like to inform you about the history of Mount Everest, the culture of climbing in Nepal, and the dangers that people face as they try to make the summit of Mount Everest. First, let's start with the history of Mount Everest. Mount Everest is part of the Himalayan mountain range. It sits on the border of Nepal and Tibet. Its elevation is at 29,000 feet, which makes it the highest mountain in the world. The funny thing is that it sits on a set of tectonic plates that push it up more each year, so it's actually growing taller every year. I spent some time growing up in Washington State, where they have Mount Rainier. It's this enormous mountain. It just seems to tower over all these neighboring cities. So I always looked out in awe at this mountain and just felt, how big it was. Mount Rainier is at 14,000 feet elevation. That's less than half, or that's more than half of Everest elevation. Everest elevation at 29,000 feet is actually the cruising altitude of most airliners. So this is a picture I took on a flight to Seattle last year. It kind of gives you a perspective on just how huge this mountain is. Here's Mount Rainier off the wing. Its summit at 14,000 feet is here. If you were to be able to put Mount Everest into this picture, its summit would be up here at 29,000 feet. So almost 60 years ago, in 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa guide, Tenzing Norgay, led a big group of experienced climbers, and they were actually the first people to be able to reach the summit. Today, that journey has grown in popularity as thousands more have tried to follow in their footsteps. So now that I've talked to you about the history of Mount Everest, I'd like to go into some of the culture of trekking in Nepal. Nepal has a really rich sense of culture in this Himalayan area. The people known as the Sherpa people practice Buddhism. They have an enormous respect for the mountain and make Buddhism a big part of their daily life. They pray to monks and the gods, asking for permission just to be able to climb the mountain and for protection to do so. They also have these prayer flags that they have all over the Himalayas, which protect them as they're climbing. The Sherpa people are well known as elite mountaineers and also for the guides that lead people on the treks to Everest Base Camp and also to the summit. So not everybody actually wants to reach the top of Mount Everest. Some people want to get a taste of Mount Everest by hiking to base camp. It sounds really easy, but it's actually a pretty grueling journey. It takes anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks just to get there, and you're crossing 75 miles to do so, according to Trekking in Nepal Himalayas. Once you reach base camp, you're at 17,000 feet elevation. So if we go back to this picture of Mount Rainier, here's the summit of Mount Rainier, and once you reach base camp, you're that far above Mount Rainier. So there are no roads, so all of the goods that people carry are taken to the towns by porters and also yaks. The porters are really strong. There's an article on NPR called The Mysterious Strengths of Sherpas that explains how they have basically acclimated to the lack of oxygen in the area, and they can actually carry more than their own body weight in baggage. So by carrying all the goods, they let the hikers do the walking and deal with altitude sickness and that sort of thing without having to carry all their stuff. Now that we've talked about the history of Everest and the culture of climbing, I'd like to go over the dangers that people face as they try to reach the summit. It's a really lofty goal to be able to reach the summit. You have to deal with lacks of oxygen, altitude sickness, dangerous terrain, and constantly changing weather. Like I said, it's up there at cruising altitude, so people in that level of elevation have to deal with jet stream and crazy winds, storms that roll in quickly. When you're at the summit, there's only a third the amount of oxygen than at sea level. So it's extremely difficult to breathe. According to the book, Top of the World, many people have to use supplemental oxygen just to be able to get that high. If you run out, it's really easy to become disoriented, to make mistakes, and to die. So in order to acclimatize and help to not get altitude sickness, the climbers climb high during the day and then they descend back down. They call this climbing high and sleeping low. It allows their body to acclimatize while they're sleeping, and then they basically repeat it the next day. So after you get to Everest Base Camp, you still have 5 more camps until you reach the summit. The first part, which is the Khumbu Ice Falls, is actually the most dangerous part. Because you're walking through an active glacier, there are constant shifts in the ice, avalanches, seracs, which are giant pieces of ice as big as a school bus that are falling. You have to be really careful. There are huge crevasses, some that are as wide as 50 feet, and they take these aluminum ladders, tie them together, and walk across them to get across these crevasses. So as you can see in these photos, you can see some of the crazy terrain. You can see how they have these ladders just stretched across and are holding on to just a thin rope trying to make their way across. Imagine the weather that comes in, big gusts of wind, one misstep and you can be buried in the middle of a crevasse. According to the documentary Dying for Everest, there have been thousands who have successfully summited, but hundreds have died trying. Everest is still littered to this day with hundreds of bodies. There's just no way to get them down. There aren't many helicopters that can go that high. The physical demands on the body are really hard, so people aren't going to spend that kind of exertion just trying to take a body off the mountain. In John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, he says that if you become immobile on the mountain, you'll likely die on the mountain because of these conditions. So today I've informed you about the history, the culture, and also the dangers of trying to summit Mount Everest. So in closing, I'd like to end with a quote by one of the great Everest climbers. His name is George Mallory. "Why seek to scale Mount Everest? Why strive to crown that cruel crest and deathward dare? Because it's there. So if you cannot understand that there is something in man which responds to the challenge of this mountain and goes out to meet it, that the struggle is the struggle of life itself, upward and forever upward, then you won't see why we go. What we get from this adventure is just sheer joy, and joy is, after all, the end of life. We do not live to eat and make money. We eat and make money to be able to enjoy life. That is what life means and what life is for."